What's up, Zags fans? I am Cole Forsman with Gonzaga Bulldogs on SI, part of the Sports Illustrated Network. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to a very special guest. He is a PhD statistician, data scientist, and you probably know him best for the brains, the CEO, the founder of one of college basketball's most popular analytics websites, evanmia.com. He is Evan Miyakawa himself. Evan, thank you for joining me today. Thanks for taking the time to talk. How are you doing? What's your energy level like as the college basketball season is right around the corner?
I'm very excited. It feels like every day we're getting closer, and now that we're starting to get some of these exhibition games happening, it really just feels like it's right around the corner, and so there's a lot to discuss for sure.
Absolutely. And we messaged a little bit before this. I mentioned that I really want to do it because I have this fascination with numbers trying to explain sort of the weirdness around us, not even just college basketball, but just the world in general. And I wanted to be a statistician growing up as a fact. And I couldn't even really handle community college level calculus. So at a certain point, I realized maybe this isn't the right path for me. But so I leaned more into the journalism and using words to kind of express, my thoughts on things. But for you, it's interesting creating an own algorithms and ways to explain college basketball. I'm curious, where does this sort of affinity for numbers and for formulas and how does that sort of where does that start and how does it sort of express your life and your story?
Sure, sure. I mean, I've always been very like mathematically minded growing up. I ended up getting my undergrad in mathematics and then went on to get my PhD in statistics. So that certainly counts for something. I think what's really drawn me to statistics, and then when you talk about sports with that, is I love being able to like quantify and measure things that I have questions about in real life. And when it comes to sports, I mean, sports is one of the most obvious applications of statistics, of data analysis, because there's so much stuff that we really care about and are invested in as fans that we don't really know exactly what's going to happen. Sports are random, and random outcomes can make or break your team, your season, or as a fan, your own experience. And so, when it comes to college basketball, and specifically, and why I'm drawn to college basketball, I've always grown up a big college basketball fan. I grew up in Indiana. I was a big Butler Bulldogs fan growing up, so in the heart of basketball country. And I've always found myself wanting to apply like math to college basketball specifically because I think college basketball is more ripe for like these using these data driven objective tools than almost any other sport that we watch in America, because not only do you have like over 350 teams every single year, and all of those teams only play about maybe a tenth of the total teams in Division One. So there's so much uncertainty about like there's a majority of teams you have never faced. So you don't actually know what would happen on the court, even by the end of the season. And then, of course, you have all of this roster turnover every single year, where every single team, especially in the modern portal era, is comprised so differently than how they used to be the year prior. There is so much uncertainty. No one knows what's going to happen. And that's why, preseason rankings are so hotly debated, because everyone has a right to have their own opinion as to who they think is going to be a good team or good player. Because at the end of the day, going into a year, we don't know who the best team is going to be. We don't know who the best player is going to be. Even by the end of the year, we probably don't know who's going to win the national championship. And so I think that's what makes tools like my site so valuable to coaches, to fans, to media members, because it helps you actually like ground what you're thinking in reality and in these kind of objective truths that aren't influenced by these biases. And so when you can then combine that with your own what you're seeing, it really allows you to be much more informed about the sport.
Absolutely. I think that's the best way to put it is that was kind of my next question that there's this, I mean, we're all humans still. We have all of our own opinions and biases, like you said, and numbers don't always, when you use the logistics and you go through it, sometimes the numbers don't always equate to what you want in your head it to be. And I think in college basketball, the main, I don't want to say the mainstream way of doing it, but I mean, the NCAA tournament, how we see teams is very subjective. I mean, there's numbers involved, there's analytics, but it's still people in a room gathered and seeding teams. The AP poll and some of the other more popular ranking systems are just eye tests. So for you yourself, how do you also sort of balance, what your numbers say about a team or a player with your own eye test instead
Mhm.
of what you perceive and your knowledge of the sport?
My belief in general is that the most informed person is someone who combines their own expert knowledge of that sport or that technical space with these data driven objective tools like what I do. If you merge those together, you become the most informed possible. You shouldn't take all of just one or all the other. I don't just blindly trust my analytics and say like this is the truth and there's nothing else than the truth here. And I also don't just completely disregard that and only say it's just eye test only. It's just, what I believe from watching basketball games. You put the two together, and I think that's what really makes you the most truly knowledgeable and able to predict most likely what's going to happen, or from a coach's perspective, able to most properly understand how your team is doing, how your players are doing, how to scout opponents, all that sort of stuff. So I think you have to merge them together. And for me, obviously, I lean really heavily on the data side of things. But the way that I continually to like tweak and upgrade and modify what my statistical models look like is influenced by what I'm actually watching. Does this make sense? And if this doesn't make sense from like what I'm seeing on my spreadsheet to what I'm seeing on the court, why does it not make sense? And sometimes the numbers can actually show me the truth of like, here I thought I was seeing this and actually that's not true and there's a good reason for it. And then other times, pretty rarely, but sometimes I'll see something and it's like, okay, something's probably off about the way that I'm trying to measure this thing. And so I need to update or improve this. And so I'm constantly making tweaks and adjustments because of what I'm actually witnessing to end up making kind of the best marriage of the two.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I think the struggle is always ourselves is finding how they all mesh together and not overlapping or not clashing. And I think that's why you see, or maybe partly why you see so many different ranking systems. Ken Palm just released their preseason rankings the other day. Bart Torvik has had, it seems like an ongoing ranking system since the season ended. Um, how even the NCAA has its own net system now. Like what what about your algorithms sort of differentiate it from the others, and really like what do fans and the media even need to like what should we realize about each of these to sort of really understand what we're looking at?
Yeah, I think it can be confusing for fans sometimes because they'll say, "Aren't you guys all doing the same thing? Like, how are you ending up with such different numbers?" Like, in a lot of cases, my like preseason rankings and even during a season, they'll align pretty closely to Ken Pom, for example. And when you look at our preseason rankings, they're pretty much in line. But there are obviously some teams that are different. Like he has I think I have Miami ranked 40 spots higher than Ken Pom in the preseason. And I know the reasons why that might be, but for the general fan, it's like, how can you arrive at such a different conclusion, right? Well, the reality is your model is only good as the data that you're feeding it. And each person who builds something like this with their own kind of technical knowledge will maybe have a slightly different way that they either like gather data and format it to kind of tell a story or, choosing different things that they think are probably going to be the most informative. One of the things that really makes my modeling unique, and I think something that it does better than any of these other sites out there, is I really lean heavily into the individual player evaluation side of things in terms of giving a value to every single player of basically predicting going forward how impactful they're going to be for their team on the court in offense and defense. And I measure it looks at your individual statistical efficiencies, things like shooting and rebounding and turnovers and stuff like that, but it also looks at the other stuff that you can't quantify with box score numbers, like how are you impacting your team performance when they're on the floor, and what's the strength of opponents that each player is playing against on the other side of the court. And then I also have an aspect too of looking at the history of each player, looking at their recruiting profile coming out of high school, and what does that tell us about the potential that they have to reach in college? How do they perform last year? How do they perform 2 or 3 years ago? Combining all of that to get a very kind of comprehensive look at a player, and ultimately then those numbers not only are helpful on an individual basis, but then when you kind of put that together as a roster, it gives a much better picture of how strong your roster is going to be going into a season. And that obviously is probably the most important factor that goes into how good your team's going to be. There's obviously other factors as well, like coaching and program and things like that. But the roster talent part of it is a massive, massive part. And I think I do that really well. And I certainly do that in a much more public way than a lot of these other sites because no one else really has like 5,000, like player rankings of 5,000 players going into a season. And I have that. And that can be ripe for some scrutiny. But the fact that I'm putting it out there means I believe in this. And by and large, it's going to do a pretty good job.
And that is true. The more you put out there, the more room there is for error. But at the same time, that just shows more conviction in sort of the process. And yeah, the player ratings. I've always wondered why other websites, at least they're not public. I'm sure on the back end there is that sort of factoring in to what degree, who really knows. But obviously, your player ratings, they're right there essentially for anyone with a subscription to your website to see. And I think that's a good segue into really Gonzaga's roster this year because you look at it, and I was looking at it compared to last season, and I want to get your thoughts also on how these preseason startup numbers compare to how an end of season does. But just looking at it, Gonzaga has this season two players with a Bayesian performance rating of over 5.00. Last season, they had five of the players with that in that sort of category. I'm wondering now, three of them left. Sort of, what is the website, the algorithm sort of say? What do the numbers sort of indicate about Gonzaga this year and going into the season?
Yeah, well, obviously the roster makeup in is going to be look very different for Gonzaga this year, and I think relatively speaking, I think Gonzaga has done a good job over the years of really like retaining key talent from one year to the next. I think the reality is when you lose guys from last year, like Ryan Nemhard and Nolan Hickman, and even Caleb Battle, who came in and had a really strong year, there's I think this is going to feel maybe one of the most different years for Gonzaga fans in terms of what last year to this year looks like, especially when you're losing your point guard who kind of defined the whole offense. But with that being said, when you look at the top of the roster, yeah, I think maybe your starting five isn't analytically speaking as strong as it was last year. But in terms of like star power at the top, getting Graham Ike back, I mean, this is one of the big things I preach in general for teams in terms of roster building. Is I've done a lot of studies of looking at what are the best ways to build a roster in the modern portal era when you have so many different options of different places to recruit players and things like that. And it always often comes back to you gain an edge by retaining a lot of your key talent. If you compare a team that's two teams that are equally talented going into a season, but one has a lot of players who returned from last year and one is mostly like newcomers, transfers, freshmen, etc. More often than not, the team with the returning talent is going to perform better, and that's just kind of what we've seen. And so, getting a guy like Graham Ike back, obviously, he's going to be in that preseason All-American conversation. He's just an absolutely productive stat monster, really. And then you also have Braden Huff coming back too, who I also have ranked inside the top 50. Braden Huff, I think, was one of the more maybe controversial players I had ranked really highly last year for a lot of the year. But really, basically, what it comes down to is on a per possession basis, what Huff was able to do, especially offensively for Gonzaga last year, and even in the year prior, even in a limited sample size, he's just so good. His individual numbers look fantastic, and how well Gonzaga played offensively was really good. I think you're going to kind of be forced to hey, we need to play both these players more together, and I'm very excited to see how that works. I think back to Auburn last year and how they had Janai Broome and they had Dylan Cardwell both coming back, who the year prior almost never played together. And Auburn found a way to get both those guys to play well, and they made a Final Four. They were one of the strongest teams all year. So I'm not saying that that's like the exact same for Gonzaga, but in terms of having two big men who can pair off of each other, I'm really excited to see how that looks because I think both individually bring a lot of qualities, especially on the offensive end.
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot more of the Huff EK tandem. The end of the NCAA tournament was really when they had to kind of start doing that, just to kind of put the most talent on the floor possible. And again, small sample size, but the numbers looked really great. And yes, on EvanMia.com last season, Huff was the highest rated Gonzaga player. Went him, and then Ryan Nemhard, and then Graham Ike. Obviously, with Nemhard out, and it's not really like his points. There's that many points and that many assists to go around. I know that's not really how these go, but at the same time, I understand when players graduate, players leave, even on a national level, players some has the water has to rise for somebody, right? They have to move up somehow. And Graham Ike was one of the biggest. I think last season he finished around 80 in the 80s, I believe, in the country in the BPR. This season, like you just mentioned, in the top 15. How does the algorithm really like take into account where does it foresee a player jump? What kind of factors does it kind of take into that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things. Obviously, for some players, especially younger players, there's kind of just a natural like improvement expected for, say, a freshman to a sophomore, especially for players who were 4 or 5 stars out of high school who really have kind of that untapped potential that they still need to reach. And a lot of times there's a big jump predicted for those players. But also in terms of just statistical categories that often are the most indicative of how a player is going to play in the future. So for a guy like EK, when you just look at how productive he was, how efficient he was, even with the large workload that he had. And then you talk about a guy who's going to be going from a junior to a senior, and you've like eliminated one group of players who they're seniors last year who he played against, and now you're replacing those with like baby freshmen who he's going to be like completely able to manhandle. I think when you look at a player with his skill set and how reliable and consistent he's been, and the fact that like we already saw flashes of it last year in Gonzaga really running offense through him, I think it's going to be even more the case this year. There's just a lot of things in his profile that point to just like he's going to be really dominant this year. And so, I think one of the things that maybe dinged him a little bit last year was that, he was very productive from a statistical sense, but in terms of maybe how Gonzaga performed on the court, there were other players who were slightly more effective in terms of their overall impact on team performance. But I think when you look at the individual stuff that he did well last year, I think he's going to be the fulcrum for this team. And so there's a lot of things statistically that point to like, yeah, he was great last year. I think he's going to be even better this year.
I think Zags fans are really hoping so, and even so, even the year prior to last season was really good. Last season, and it seems like he's had these slow starts to the season. I think his health wise now this season is probably the best it's been since he got to Gonzaga. So that'll be very interesting to monitor, especially with how his player rating either goes up or down to start the season, and if he has to bring it back up in conference play, which he has done, or if it's just a steady streamline. I think a good way to monitor that will be through your player ratings with EK and Huff at the helm. Gonzaga checks in at number 10 in evanmia.com's preseason rankings for the country. It has Houston at number 1, Purdue, Duke, Florida, UConn, Michigan, Arizona, Illinois, BYU, then Gonzaga. Um, I've looked, and so the Tyon Grant Foster situation at Gonzaga is still in limbo. He hasn't received a full waiver. He did receive a practice waiver prior to their preseason event earlier this month. How would a guy like Tyon Grant Foster sort of change the dynamic of the Zags and where their national standing would be? What would he sort of bring to the table?
Yeah, I think I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I think his projection, if he was on the roster, would be like sixth or seventh best on the team. And so I think that would be enough to move Gonzaga up maybe another spot or two. But it's not going to be like he's not seen, according to my analytics, as being like a top 3 player on the team. So certainly definitely an added bonus, but I don't think it'll massively change like from 10th to 5th, for example. So I don't remember the exact number, but I know I've looked at his projection before. And so I think it slots somewhere in the 6 to 7 range on the roster, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, I think last year he ended Grand Canyon around the 2 point something mark in the BPR. I keep mentioning the number. What exactly does the Bayesian performance rating, for those who haven't really read into it, in your own kind of words, what does that? What is that rating really consist of?
Yeah, it's basic. The quick explanation is it's a number that represents how much more valuable this player is than an average Division 1 player in terms of points per 100 possessions they bring on the court. So a guy like Graham Ike has a starting BPR this season of 7.8. Basically, what that means is if you were to put Ike on a court with like 9 other average players on his team and on the other team, his team would outscore the other team by 7.8 points over the course of 100 possessions. So it's basically a rating above 0 means you're better than average in Division 1. A rating below 0 in either offense, defense, or overall means you're worse than average. So that's kind of how you contextualize that.
And it seems like your relative rating, which is what sort of the team ratings, how they're stacked up, are in a similar manner, correct? If
Yes.
Gonzaga has a 21.4, they are expected to beat the average team by that. But you've also taken into account that the teams ranked around them. It's not a lot of these other websites. It is just based on the average NCAA team, but then there doesn't really account for like, is BYU going to beat Gonzaga kind of thing. And yours, I know you've tweaked it a little bit, and it does kind of take that into account as well. Correct?
Yeah, there's matchup specific variables like how good does a team play against good opponents versus bad opponents? How do they play in high tempo versus low tempo games? Things like that that I can actually predict the individual matchups. And there might be some situations where over the course of a season, like you might have a team that has a better overall like average efficiency, but it's like from beating up bad teams. And if you actually match them up against a good team, they're a little more suspect. And so I'll actually change the order based on how the head-to-head matchups are typically predicted to go.
That is a Gonzaga haters crux right there. Or they always beat up on the WCC, but they never in non-conference or in the NCAA tournament they fall. It's the Gonzaga haters mo, I should say. Um, so if you had, we talked a little bit about Tyon. Is there who on this Gonzaga roster, whether based on your numbers or from your own kind of understanding, who do you kind of see as being the most impactful newcomer to this year's team?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think you have to look at both Jalen Worley and Braden Smith, who Smith has been on the team, but he hasn't really played. As I think those are big additions, and especially in the case of Smith, who hasn't played in a while, there's a pretty high like variance attached to him in terms of like how good is he going to be. And so currently, I haven't projected as the fourth best player on the roster, but realistically, like he could be much better, much worse than that, just because it's been a while. And so I think that's a really big X factor for this team. Another player who certainly has the potential to be a really, really big player is Mario St. Superi. Obviously, one of the things that is tough for me to quantify is especially for either freshmen who were highly recruited out of high school but then like missed their freshman year, or international players who are coming in who it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how to rate them. A lot of times their rating going into a season will be a little bit conservative, and so for a player like him, I have him ranked, I think, as the eighth best player on the team going into the season. I know some Gonzaga fans would say, like, there's no shot. He's going to be a top five player because of how talented he is. And that might end up being true. And if that's true, that's going to be a massive boost for this team. A lot of times, though, you do have players like him who, he hasn't played a single minute. People are really excited about him for a variety of reasons, and then it may or may not pan out. And so a lot of times those ratings will be a little bit more on the conservative side of like, hey, this player probably will be good, but I'm not going to like put immediately confidence in him. So if he ends up outperforming his preseason projection, then I think Gonzaga is going to be in really good shape.
Okay, I just wanted to get your quick thoughts then. That was a good breakdown of kind of the impactful players. I think Saint Superi really is a Gonzaga fan's dream to kind of break out this season. I wanted to get your pick, kind of your player of the year pick, who you kind of see. Braden Smith in your ranking system is by far and away above everybody else. I think he's about almost 2 points higher than everybody else. And it seems like all the other websites, all the other analysts kind of have that as well. Do you see that playing out as well? Do you see Braden Smith, or would you rather take the field at this point?
Ooh, good question. If I'm taking Smith of the field, I'm probably taking the field just because there is so much uncertainty with how these things are going to plan out. But it's probably close. Like I might put it at end of season. Smith wins National Player of the Year at maybe 40%. I actually have a way of actually like simulating that and seeing what his chances would be, would be kind of an interesting exercise. But I mean, we haven't seen in my preseason analytics, we haven't seen a gap between the best player and the second best player going into a season since Zach Edey at Purdue 2 years ago when he was the reigning National Player of the Year. And obviously Smith is not the reigning National Player of the Year, but I just think he brings so much to the table. He's already shown himself to be such a valuable player for Purdue. And I just think he's going to dominate in his senior year.
Awesome. One more question for you. Who on this Gonzaga roster do you think kind of has the chance to outperform their BPR the most this season?
Ooh, well, I mean, I feel like the obvious answer for me probably would be Mario St. Superi, just because there's so much more excitement around him than kind of where my projection has him. I mean, another player potentially would be like Steele Venters. Again, another case of someone who has been like people have been waiting to see the impact that he's going to have in the court for Gonzaga. And so again, he if he ends up being a really healthy version of himself and is kind of what they wanted him to be when they brought him in, like he could be great. So I'm excited to see what he does as well.
Awesome. I appreciate the time, Evan.